Hey everybody, and welcome back. Today we're continuing our look at the massive changes coming with the Elsweyr chapter to ESO. Specifically, we'll be looking at the Week 2 patch notes, which apply mostly to the Nightblade class. Nightblades, poor Nightblades. Now, if you missed it last week, let me just quickly summarize the changes for Nightblades. In-Cap Strike got nerfed, as did Surprise Attack, and both morphs of Grim Focus. There's actually more to it, but I don't have the heart to talk about it right now, so check out the full explanation of patch changes in the previous video. If you missed that, there's a link for that in the description below. Also remember to subscribe to the channel for plenty more Elsweyr coverage, build videos, and more coming up very soon. Alright, jumping into Nightblade class changes for Week 2, starting with the Assassination skill line, and it looks like they made some changes to Blur this week. Blur, if you're not familiar with it, this is kind of like our movement speed buff. It is a Magicka-based buff, so it's mostly used by Magicka Nightblades. You can, for example, increase your speed while you're sneaking, and things like that. So they specifically changed the double take morph. Renamed and reworked the morph. It's now called Phantasmal Escape, but it no longer grants Major Expedition for 4 seconds. So this was one of those skills that, quote-unquote, is redundant in the Nightblade class. That's because Cripple grants Major Expedition. You also have Refreshing Path that grants Major Expedition. And then you have this skill, Blur. Now, instead of Major Expedition on this morph, it's going to give immunity to snares and immobilizes for 4 seconds based on your rank. So this is an interesting change. It's not so much of a negative change, just kind of a reworking of the skill. But depending upon how you play, right? Like I mentioned, a lot of people use this skill for sneak builds, where this gives you Major Expedition while you're sneaking. And it's no longer going to do that. So that kind of play style, gank builds and whatnot for Magicka Nightblade, you'll probably use Race Against Time now. That actually probably has an even lower Magicka cost. I like the fact that it's giving the snare and immobilization immunity for 4 seconds. It's kind of like a magic version of forward momentum. The question is, would you use this on a stamina Nightblade? I don't think you would, because again, it's a Magicka skill. We're already trying to run Cloak, and we might have to run Mark Target next patch, so this is just another Magicka skill that Stamina Nightblades probably don't have room for. If you do, it's great, but like I said, I don't know if you will. Now, as far as tank and healer builds, especially in PvP, this will be a nice option. If you're not running two-handed for the forward momentum buff, then this does give you a nice option. Remember too, this skill does give you Major Evasion, which is that reduction of AoE damage, so it's a very nice skill. Let's talk about Lotus Fan next. This wasn't in the patch notes last week, but apparently it was made last week, so they increased the dot damage by a lot on the skill, 175%. It is AoE, so they're trying to make it more in line with their dot standards, which is fine. I guess, remember that this skill is going to apply minor vulnerability as well on the base skill, so they're really pushing to use this skill for Nightblades. On a Magicka Nightblade, we still are missing a lot of survivability that makes this playstyle difficult in PvP, so I don't know how viable this is yet, but the increased damage is pretty nice. I do like that. So Grim Focus got a buff. We got a buff, you guys. We got a 200 millisecond buff. Excellent. /sarcasm. So they reduced the minimum travel time from 450 to 250 milliseconds. I believe they did this on Crystal Shards as well. So they're just trying to make those abilities feel a little bit faster, feel a little bit better, especially in PvP. So I like that. It really doesn't deal with any of the issues, though, with this skill. Losing Minor Berserk, turning into a heal that you need to have 5 light attacks first before you get the heal off. You have to be in like 7 meter range. Don't get me started on this skill, but Slowly but surely. Maybe they'll add something back next week. Maybe they'll add Minor Berserk back next week. Who knows? Let's jump down to siphoning. So, Cripple. Cripple, this is pretty bread and butter skill for a Magicka Nightblade. This is our speed, this is our damage over time, and it's a snare and a root if you choose the Cripple morph. So, check out the change here. This ability and its morphs no longer grant major expedition, but can now be placed on an infinite amount of targets. So if I understand that correctly, I can now root using Cripple as many targets as I want and apply the snare and the dot. It used to be just a single target, and then it would just change targets if you cast it on a different enemy. So this may not seem like a big change to some people, but if you play Magicka Nightblade, especially a ranged Magicka Nightblade build, this feels really bad. Feels bad, man, on this change, because you're losing one of the main things that made Magicka Nightblade what it is, and that's the speed and the ability to engage and disengage and get away quickly. It's that whole playstyle, and part of that comes from Major Expedition on Cripple. That makes the Magicka Nightblade in PvP really, really mobile, and that's part of the whole playstyle, and now this is gone. You know, the developers talk a lot about this huge idea of redundancy, and we're getting rid of the redundancy, you guys. It's so good. Don't you believe us? Like, you won't be redundant anymore. But I think there needs to be some balance in that, because, yes, I get it's the same buff. It's the same buff that we get from Refreshing Path. But Refreshing Path is a very niche skill. It's really not used in PvP. It's used by like a tank pulling your group through a dungeon. Then Refreshing Path is great. It's great for going from trash fight to trash fight in a dungeon, but all it is Major Expedition in a straight line. That's not useful for PvP. That's terrible. That's basically telling your enemy where you're going. I'm going this way, guys. Just dump AoEs and ultimates on me so I can have my Major Expedition. No, this is a terrible change. So I really hope the developers revert some of this and start to get the idea that redundancy is not a bad thing if the buff is being used in different ways for each skill. The Major Expedition on the Cripple ability is for a specific playstyle that, again, is now going to be much harder to do competitively, especially in PvP. It was great for PvE too, to avoid like AoEs and red circles and boss mechanics and all that stuff. Having that extra maneuverability was awesome. So I don't see any rationale for removing this skill at all, except that whole idea of redundancy, which again, I don't think it applies in this case because the buff is being used in different ways for each skill. So let's look at Debilitate. Debilitate is the other morph of Cripple. You don't get the root for Debilitate. What you would get is a 100% Magicka return. It actually got buffed last patch, and it was a really good skill because it still gave Major Expedition, and you could apply it to infinite targets and get Magicka back when they died. So it was a really good morph. And there was actually a thought process here. Did I want the extra Immobilize, or did I want the extra Magicka return? And it was a good thing for players to have to choose that. So they completely ripped out the Magicka return, which is sad. Instead, it applies minor Magicka steal while the dot persists. So again, I don't understand the thinking here, because this buff is easily available with a Destruction Staff. And not only that, with a Destruction Staff, it's free. Why would I use this? The developers talk a lot about redundancy. This seems just as redundant to me. Applying a buff to Cripple that I can already get with a better skill that's cheaper. With these changes that, they're done for reducing redundancy of class buffs, I think the idea was good initially, but the execution really is not good overall. What they should have done with these three skills, talking about Cripple, talking about Double Take, and the third skill, which is Refreshing Path, what they should have done is they should have looked at, okay, these three abilities apply the same buff, Major Expedition. Which of these abilities is the least useful? I think any Nightblade player with any amount of experience would have told you Refreshing Path is the least useful skill. Take away Major Expedition from Refreshing Path, turn it into something else, make it more useful. Do something with that skill instead of nerfing these skills which were already fine, especially Cripple and, part of the class kit, especially of Magicka Nightblade. Instead of nerfing these, just change the skill that's the worst. I don't know, that's just my thoughts anyways. Let me know what you guys think of the Nightblade changes for week 2 in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video at all, remember to smack that like button for me. It really does help out the channel and helps these videos get noticed on YouTube. So until then, fingers crossed for week 3. Hopefully we see some positive changes. And until then, I'll see you around in the next video. Thanks.